The phone rang at exactly 11:47 p.m., and Victoria knew something was wrong. Not because of the late hour but because of the silence that followed when she answered. She could hear breathing on the other end, heavy and nervous, like someone trying to gather courage to speak. Her heart started beating faster as she sat up in bed, looking at the empty space beside her where her husband Richard should have been. "Hello," she whispered again, gripping the phone tighter. "Victoria, I'm sorry to call so late." The voice belonged to Sarah, her best friend from college. But Sarah sounded different, sad, almost scared. "I need to tell you something and I don't know how to say it." Victoria's stomach dropped. She had been married to Richard for 8 years and lately something felt different. He came home later from work, took more business trips, and seemed distant when they were together. She had pushed these thoughts away, telling herself she was being paranoid. But now, sitting in their big empty house at midnight, she knew her worst fears were about to come true. "What is it, Sarah?" Victoria asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I saw Richard tonight. At the Plaza Hotel downtown." Sarah paused and Victoria could hear her taking a deep breath. "He wasn't alone, Victoria. He was with Stella Morrison." Stella Morrison. The name hit Victoria like a punch to the stomach. Everyone knew who Stella Morrison was, the tall, blonde supermodel who appeared on magazine covers and walked runways in Paris and Milan. She was everything Victoria wasn't. Tall where Victoria was average height, blonde where Victoria had beautiful dark skin and natural black hair, famous where Victoria was just a regular person trying to make her small interior design business work. "Are you sure it was him?" Victoria asked, even though she already knew the answer. Sarah wouldn't call her at midnight unless she was absolutely certain. "I'm sure, honey." They were holding hands and Sarah's voice broke. They were kissing. "I'm so sorry, Victoria. I didn't want to tell you over the phone, but I couldn't let you find out another way." Victoria set the phone down on the bed and stared at the wall. The beautiful bedroom she had decorated with so much love and care suddenly felt like a prison. The expensive furniture Richard had bought, the artwork they had chosen together, the photos of their wedding day, everything seemed to mock her now. She picked up the phone again. "How long have you known?" she asked. "This is the first time I've seen them together, I swear," Sarah said quickly. But Victoria, they looked comfortable. Like they'd been together for a while. After hanging up, Victoria sat in the darkness for hours. She thought about all the signs she had ignored. The new cologne Richard had started wearing. The way he guarded his phone. The mysterious credit card bills for expensive restaurants she had never been to. The business trips that seemed to happen more and more often. When Richard finally came home at 3 a.m., Victoria was still awake, sitting in the living room with all the lights off. She heard his car in the driveway, heard him trying to be quiet as he opened the front door. She listened to his footsteps on the stairs, heading to their bedroom. Part of her wanted to confront him right then, but another part of her, the part that still hoped this was all a terrible mistake, wanted to pretend she was asleep. "Victoria?" Richard's voice came from the bedroom doorway. "Are you awake?" She didn't answer. She heard him moving around the room, getting ready for bed. The man she had loved for 10 years, married for 8, was living a lie. And now she was living it too. The next morning Victoria woke up on the couch. Her neck hurt, and her eyes were swollen from crying. Richard was already gone, another early meeting, according to the note he left on the kitchen counter. The same excuse he had been using for months. Victoria made coffee with shaking hands and sat at the kitchen table, staring at her phone. She knew what she had to do, but she wasn't ready. How do you ask your husband if he's cheating on you? How do you destroy your marriage with a single question? She spent the day cleaning the house, something she did when she was nervous. She organized closets, scrubbed bathrooms, and vacuumed carpets that were already clean. Anything to keep her hands busy and her mind occupied. But every time she stopped moving, the images came back. Richard holding hands with Stella Morrison. Richard kissing another woman. Richard choosing someone else. When Richard came home that evening, Victoria was waiting for him in the kitchen. She had spent an hour getting ready, putting on makeup to hide the fact that she had been crying, choosing an outfit that made her feel confident. If she was going to have the most important conversation of her marriage, she wanted to look strong. "Hey, beautiful," Richard said, kissing her cheek like he did every day. Like nothing had changed. Like he hadn't been living a double life. "How was your day?" "We need to talk," Victoria said, her voice steadier than she felt. Richard's smile faded. He set down his briefcase and looked at her carefully. "About what?" "About Stella Morrison." The change in Richard's face was immediate. The color drained from his cheeks and his mouth opened slightly, like he was trying to think of what to say. For a moment, Victoria hoped he would deny it, hoped he would look confused and ask her what she was talking about. But instead, he closed his eyes and sat down heavily in one of the kitchen chairs. "How did you find out?" he asked quietly. Those 5 words destroyed 8 years of marriage. Victoria had been holding on to a tiny hope that this was all a misunderstanding, that Sarah had been wrong, that Richard would laugh and explain everything. But his question confirmed her worst fears. "So it's true," she said, more to herself than to him. Richard looked up at her, and for the first time in months, he looked like the man she had married. Sad, guilty, and completely lost. "Victoria, I can explain." "Explain what?" "That you're having an affair with a supermodel? That you've been lying to me for months? That our marriage means nothing to you?" Victoria's voice was getting louder, all the hurt and anger she had been holding back for the past day finally coming out. "It's not that simple," Richard said, running his hands through his hair. "I never meant for this to happen. I met Stella at a charity event 6 months ago and we started talking and—" "6 months?" Victoria interrupted. "You've been cheating on me for 6 months?" Richard stood up and tried to reach for her, but Victoria stepped back. She couldn't let him touch her, not now, not when she was finally seeing him clearly for the first time in years. "I was going to tell you," he said. "I've been trying to figure out how to handle this situation." "Handle this situation?" Victoria repeated. "Is that what our marriage is to you? A situation?" "That's not what I meant and you know it," Richard said, his voice getting defensive. "This is complicated, Victoria. Stella and we have something special. Something I've never felt before." Each word was like a knife in Victoria's heart. She had loved this man completely, had built her entire life around their relationship, had dreamed of growing old with him. And now he was standing in their kitchen, telling her that he had found something special with someone else. "Get out," she said quietly. "Victoria, please, let's talk about this. We can work through this." "Get out," she screamed, surprising herself with the volume of her voice. "Get out of my house, get out of my life, and go be with your supermodel girlfriend." Richard stared at her for a long moment, and Victoria could see him making a decision. She could see the exact moment when he chose Stella Morrison over 8 years of marriage, over the woman who had loved him unconditionally, over the life they had built together. "I'll pack some things and stay at a hotel tonight," he said. "We'll talk when you've had time to calm down." "Don't you dare tell me to calm down," Victoria said, her voice deadly quiet. "And don't bother packing. I'll have your things sent to you. I never want to see you in this house again." After Richard left, Victoria collapsed on the kitchen floor and cried until she had no tears left. The house felt huge and empty around her. Everything reminded her of him, of them, of the life she thought they had been building together. She had never felt so alone in her entire life. The divorce lawyer's office smelled like leather and disappointment. Victoria sat across from Patricia Reynolds, one of the best divorce attorneys in the city, trying to explain her situation without breaking down. It had been a week since Richard moved out, and Victoria hadn't heard from him once. No phone calls, no text messages, no attempts to fix their marriage. It was as if 8 years together meant nothing to him. "Mrs. Williams, I understand this is difficult," Patricia said, her voice gentle but professional. "But I need you to tell me everything about your financial situation. Your husband is a successful businessman, and we need to make sure you get what you're entitled to." Victoria nodded, pulling out the folder of documents she had spent days gathering. Bank statements, investment accounts, property deeds, business records, the paperwork of a life she was now dismantling piece by piece. "Richard owns Williams Construction," Victoria began. "He started the company 5 years ago and it's been very successful. We own our house, which is worth about $2 million. We have joint savings accounts, and Richard has several investment portfolios." Patricia made notes as Victoria spoke, occasionally asking questions about specific assets or accounts. It was surreal, reducing 8 years of marriage to a list of possessions to be divided. "What about your own income?" Patricia asked. "I have a small interior design business," Victoria said, feeling embarrassed. "I make maybe $30,000 a year on good years. I've been focusing on supporting Richard's career, helping him entertain clients, managing our household." "That's actually very good for our case," Patricia said. "You sacrificed your own career advancement to support your husband's success. The court will take that into consideration." Victoria's phone buzzed with a text message. She glanced at it and felt her stomach turn. It was a link to a gossip website, sent by her friend Sarah. The headline read, "Construction millionaire Richard Williams and supermodel Stella Morrison, New York's hottest new couple." The article included photos of Richard and Stella at expensive restaurants, walking hand in hand down Fifth Avenue, getting into Richard's luxury car. In every photo they looked happy and carefree. Richard was smiling in a way Victoria hadn't seen in years. The article talked about their whirlwind romance, and speculated about when they might get engaged. "Mrs. Williams, are you all right?" Patricia asked, noticing Victoria's expression. Victoria showed her the article. Patricia read it quickly, her professional mask slipping slightly to show anger. "This is actually helpful for our case," Patricia said. "It establishes a clear timeline for the affair and shows your husband's lack of discretion. But I know this must be incredibly painful for you." Painful didn't begin to describe it. Victoria felt like she was watching her husband's life continue without her, like she had been erased from his story. The man in those photos wasn't the same person who had promised to love her forever. Or maybe he was exactly the same person, and Victoria had just been too blind to see it. Over the next few weeks, Victoria learned things about her husband that shocked her. Through the legal discovery process, she found out about secret credit cards, expensive gifts he had bought for Stella, trips they had taken together while Victoria thought he was working. The affair had been going on for 8 months, not 6 like Richard had claimed. The worst part was the text messages Patricia's investigator had uncovered. Messages between Richard and Stella that showed how little he thought of his marriage, how eager he was to start a new life. In one message Richard had written, "I can't wait to be free of all this. Victoria is a good person but she's so ordinary. You make me feel alive again." Ordinary. That word haunted Victoria. She stared at herself in the mirror, seeing her reflection through Richard's eyes. Her dark skin that she had always been proud of suddenly seemed plain compared to Stella's magazine-perfect appearance. Her natural hair, her average height, her simple clothes, everything about her felt inadequate. "You're not ordinary," Sarah said when Victoria told her about the text messages. "You're real. You're kind and smart and beautiful. Richard is an idiot who doesn't deserve you." But Victoria couldn't shake the feeling that maybe Richard was right. Maybe she was ordinary, and maybe that's why he had left her for someone extraordinary. The divorce proceedings dragged on for 3 months. Richard fought her on everything: the house, the savings accounts, even the furniture they had bought together. He claimed that since his business had made most of their money, he deserved the majority of their assets. He accused Victoria of being greedy, of trying to take advantage of him. The irony wasn't lost on Victoria. The man who had cheated on her, who had destroyed their marriage, was now acting like she was the villain in their story. During one particularly difficult mediation session, Richard and Victoria sat across from each other in a conference room, with their lawyers present, trying to divide up the remains of their life together. Richard looked different, thinner, more expensively dressed, like he was trying to transform himself into someone worthy of a supermodel. "I think I'm being more than fair," Richard said, sliding a settlement offer across the table. "Victoria gets the house, half the savings, and alimony for 3 years. That's generous considering she didn't contribute much to our financial success." Victoria stared at the papers, feeling humiliated. Even now, even after everything he had done, Richard was making her feel small and worthless. "Your client destroyed this marriage," Patricia said coldly. "He carried on an affair for 8 months, spent marital assets on his girlfriend, and now he wants to minimize his wife's contributions to their partnership. This offer is insulting." "My client has already moved on," Richard's lawyer replied. "He's trying to be reasonable so everyone can start fresh." "Moved on." Victoria looked at Richard, really looked at him, and realized he was already gone. Not just physically but emotionally. He had checked out of their marriage months ago, maybe years ago. She had been trying to save something that was already dead. "Fine," Victoria said quietly. "I'll take the house and half the liquid assets. I don't want alimony. I don't want anything from him that I have to keep asking for." Richard looked surprised, like he had expected her to fight harder. Maybe he wanted her to fight for him, to show him that their marriage was worth saving. But Victoria was tired of fighting for someone who didn't want to be fought for. The divorce was finalized on a cold Tuesday in March. Victoria signed the papers in Patricia's office, officially ending 8 years of marriage with a few signatures. She felt numb, like she was watching someone else's life fall apart. "What will you do now?" Patricia asked as Victoria gathered her things. "I don't know," Victoria said honestly. "Start over, I guess." That evening, Victoria sat in her big empty house, surrounded by boxes of Richard's belongings that he had never bothered to pick up. The house was officially hers now, but it didn't feel like home anymore. Every room held memories of their life together, and she couldn't escape the feeling that she was living in a museum of her failed marriage. She had given up so much for Richard. Her career dreams, her independence, her sense of self. She had molded herself into the perfect wife, the perfect supporter, the perfect background character in his success story. And in the end it hadn't been enough. Victoria picked up one of the gossip magazines Sarah had been collecting, the ones that featured Richard and Stella. The latest issue showed them at a charity gala, Stella wearing a dress that probably cost more than Victoria made in 6 months. They looked like they belonged together, both beautiful, both successful, both living the kind of glamorous life that ordinary people like Victoria could only dream about. But as Victoria studied the photos more closely, she noticed something. Richard's smile looked forced, and his eyes had a tired quality she recognized from the last months of their marriage. Stella was beautiful, but she was also holding onto Richard's arm like she was afraid he might disappear. Maybe their perfect relationship wasn't as perfect as it looked. Still, it didn't matter. Richard had made his choice and Victoria had to live with the consequences. She was 32 years old, divorced, and completely alone for the first time in over a decade. She had no idea who she was without Richard, or what she wanted from life now that her entire future had been erased. All she knew was that she couldn't stay in this house, in this city, surrounded by reminders of everything she had lost. She needed to start over somewhere new, somewhere she could figure out who Victoria Williams really was when she wasn't trying to be the perfect wife to a man who didn't want her. 3 months after the divorce was finalized, Victoria was finally starting to feel like herself again. She had sold the big house and moved into a cozy apartment downtown. She was rebuilding her interior design business and had even started dating again. Nothing serious, just coffee dates and dinners with nice men who treated her with respect. But on a sunny Thursday morning in June, everything changed again. Victoria woke up feeling sick to her stomach. At first, she thought it was the seafood she had eaten the night before, but when the nausea continued for 3 days straight, she began to suspect something else. She sat on her bathroom floor, staring at the pregnancy test in her hands, watching as 2 pink lines appeared. Pregnant. Victoria's hands shook as she set the test down on the counter. This couldn't be happening. She and Richard had been trying to have children for years with no success. They had seen fertility specialists, tried treatments, spent thousands of dollars and countless hours hoping for a baby that never came. It had been one of the biggest strains on their marriage. And now, 3 months after their divorce, when Victoria was finally starting to rebuild her life, she was pregnant with Richard's child. She made an appointment with her doctor for the next day, hoping against hope that the home test was wrong. But Dr. Martinez confirmed what Victoria already knew. "Congratulations," Dr. Martinez said with a smile. "Based on your last period, I'd say you're about 8 weeks along." 8 weeks. Victoria did the math in her head. The baby had been conceived in April, just a few weeks after the divorce was finalized. It must have happened during one of the last times she and Richard had been together, when they were still trying to work things out. "Mrs. Williams, is everything all right?" Dr. Martinez asked, noticing Victoria's pale face. "I'm divorced," Victoria said quietly. "My ex-husband doesn't know about this." Dr. Martinez nodded understandingly. "That's a difficult situation. Have you thought about whether you want to tell him?" Victoria hadn't thought about anything except the shock of being pregnant. But now, sitting in the doctor's office, she tried to imagine calling Richard with this news. He was living his new life with Stella, appearing in magazines and at social events. They looked happy together, or at least they looked like they were trying to be happy. A baby would complicate everything. Richard would have to be involved in their child's life, which meant Victoria would have to see him regularly for the next 18 years. She would have to watch him continue his relationship with Stella, maybe even watch them get married and have children of their own. She would forever be connected to the man who had broken her heart. "I need to think about this," Victoria told Dr. Martinez. "Of course. But I do need to tell you something else." Dr. Martinez looked at Victoria's chart again. "I'd like to schedule you for an ultrasound next week. Based on your symptoms and the size of your uterus, I suspect you might be carrying multiples." "Multiples?" Victoria repeated. "Twins, possibly triplets. It's not uncommon, especially for women your age who have had fertility treatments in the past." Victoria drove home in a daze. One baby was overwhelming enough, but twins or triplets? How could she possibly handle multiple children on her own? Her interior design business was just starting to recover, and she was still figuring out how to live as a single woman. She wasn't ready to be a single mother, let alone a single mother of multiple babies. That night, Victoria called Sarah. "Are you going to tell Richard?" Sarah asked after Victoria explained the situation. "I don't know," Victoria said. Part of me thinks he has a right to know. But another part of me thinks he gave up that right when he chose Stella over our marriage. What does your heart tell you? Sarah asked. Victoria was quiet for a long moment. My heart tells me that Richard hurt me more than I ever thought possible. My heart tells me that he called me ordinary and threw away 8 years of marriage for a woman he barely knew. My heart tells me that he doesn't deserve to be part of this. But what about the baby? Don't they deserve to know their father? That was the question that kept Victoria awake at night. She thought about her own childhood, growing up with both parents who loved her. She thought about the family she had always dreamed of having with Richard, the children they had tried so hard to conceive, the nursery they had planned but never created. The ultrasound appointment arrived faster than Victoria wanted. She lay on the examination table, nervous about what she might see on the screen. Dr. Martinez moved the ultrasound wand over Victoria's belly, studying the monitor intently. Well, Mrs. Williams, Dr. Martinez said with a big smile, you're having quadruplets. Quadruplets. Victoria stared at the screen, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. 4 babies. 4 healthy babies, Dr. Martinez confirmed. This is quite rare, especially conceived naturally. You're very lucky. Lucky. Victoria didn't feel lucky. She felt terrified. 4 babies meant 4 times the responsibility, 4 times the expense, 4 times the sleepless nights. How could she possibly handle 4 children on her own? But as she watched the 4 tiny heartbeats flickering on the monitor, something shifted inside her. These babies were hers. They were the family she had always wanted, even if they were coming in a way she had never expected. They were her chance to start over, to build something beautiful from the wreckage of her marriage. I'd like to print out some pictures for you, Dr. Martinez said. And we'll need to start planning for a high-risk pregnancy. Quadruplets require special care. Victoria took the ultrasound pictures home and stared at them for hours. 4 babies. 4 little miracles that she and Richard had created together during their last attempt at reconciliation. These children were the product of love, even if that love hadn't been enough to save their marriage. She thought about calling Richard, imagining his reaction to the news. He would be shocked, maybe even pleased. Richard had always wanted children. But then what? Would he expect to be involved in their lives? Would he want shared custody? Would he bring Stella around Victoria's children? The thought of Stella Morrison holding her babies, of Richard playing happy family with another woman and Victoria's children, made her feel sick. These babies were hers. She had carried them, she would raise them, she would love them unconditionally. Richard had made his choice when he chose his new life over their marriage. Victoria made a decision that would change everything. She wouldn't tell Richard about the babies. She would raise them alone, give them all the love and attention they deserved, and protect them from the pain of having a father who might abandon them the way he had abandoned her. It wasn't an easy decision, and Victoria knew it might not be the right one. But it was her decision to make. She was no longer the woman who had shaped her entire life around Richard's needs and wants. She was going to be a mother, and her children's well-being came first. Victoria quit her interior design business and spent the next few months preparing for her new life. She sold her apartment and moved to a small town 2 hours away from the city, where nobody knew her story and nobody would ask questions about her baby's father. She found a cute house with a big backyard and started thinking about how to support herself and 4 children. She had always been good at baking. It was a hobby she had enjoyed during her marriage, though Richard had never paid much attention to her cakes and cookies. But in her new town, Victoria discovered that the local bakery had closed down, leaving the community without a place to buy fresh bread and pastries. Victoria saw an opportunity. She used part of her divorce settlement to open a small bakery, working long hours to get it ready before the babies arrived. She hired a local woman named Mrs. Patterson to help her, and slowly but surely Victoria's Fresh Start Bakery became a gathering place for the community. "You make the best chocolate chip cookies I've ever tasted," Mrs. Patterson said one afternoon as they worked together in the kitchen. "And these pregnancy cravings of yours are creating some interesting new recipes." Victoria laughed, rubbing her growing belly. At 6 months pregnant, she was huge. Carrying quadruplets was like carrying a small watermelon, and she was constantly tired and uncomfortable. But she was also happier than she had been in years. "I never thought I'd be a baker," Victoria said. "But I love this. I love creating something that makes people happy." "What about the baby's father?" Mrs. Patterson asked gently. "Will he be involved?" Victoria had grown close to Mrs. Patterson over the past few months, but she still hadn't told anyone the complete truth about her situation. "Their father isn't in the picture," she said simply. "It's just going to be me and the babies." Mrs. Patterson nodded without judgment. Well, you're not really alone. This whole town is going to help you raise these children. That's what small communities do. Victoria felt tears in her eyes. For the first time since her divorce, she felt like she belonged somewhere. She had built something of her own, something that didn't depend on a man who might leave her. She was creating a life for herself and her children that was based on her own strength and talents. As her due date approached, Victoria sometimes wondered if she had made the right choice about Richard. But then she would think about how he had discarded their marriage, how he had called her ordinary, how he had chosen glamour over love. Her children deserved better than a father who might treat them as inconveniences in his perfect new life. Victoria was going to give her babies everything she had. Love, stability, and the knowledge that they were wanted and cherished. She might be doing it alone, but she wasn't going to let them down the way Richard had let her down. Victoria's new life in Millbrook was nothing like the luxurious existence she had shared with Richard, but it was entirely her own. The small town of 3,000 people felt like a different world from the city she had left behind. Here, people knew each other's names, children played safely in the streets, and the biggest excitement was the annual Harvest Festival. Victoria's Fresh Start Bakery had become the heart of the community faster than she had ever imagined. Every morning she arrived at 5 a.m. to start the ovens, despite being 7 months pregnant with quadruplets. Mrs. Patterson worried about her constantly. "Victoria, honey, you need to slow down," Mrs. Patterson said as Victoria carefully lifted a tray of fresh bread from the oven. "Those babies are going to come early and you need to save your energy." "The bakery needs me," Victoria replied, though she was breathing heavily from the simple task. "We have the Johnson wedding cake to finish, and the school ordered 200 cookies for their fundraiser." Mrs. Patterson shook her head and gently took the tray from Victoria's hands. "The bakery needs you healthy. Now sit down and let me handle the heavy work." Victoria had hired Mrs. Patterson as an assistant, but the older woman had quickly become much more than that. She was the mother figure Victoria needed, the friend who didn't judge her choices, and the person who would make sure Victoria survived the challenges ahead. "I got a call from a food magazine yesterday," Victoria said, settling into a chair behind the counter. "They want to do a story about small-town bakeries and someone recommended us." "That's wonderful," Mrs. Patterson exclaimed. "This place deserves recognition. Your apple cinnamon muffins are better than anything I've ever tasted, and don't get me started on those lemon bars." Victoria smiled. The success of the bakery still surprised her. She had started it as a way to support herself and her soon-to-arrive children, but it had become something much bigger. People drove from neighboring towns to buy her pastries, and she had already received requests to cater events and ship her baked goods to customers in the city. "I never thought I'd be a businesswoman," Victoria said, watching the steady stream of customers through the window. "When I was married to Richard, I thought my job was to support his career. I never imagined I could build something like this on my own." "You were always capable of this," Mrs. Patterson said firmly. "You just needed the chance to discover it yourself." That afternoon, Victoria was decorating the Johnson wedding cake when she felt the first contraction. It was mild, just a tightening in her belly, but it made her pause. At 32 weeks pregnant, it was too early for the babies to be born. "Mrs. Patterson," Victoria called out, trying to keep her voice calm. "I think I need to go to the hospital." The next few hours were a blur of doctors, nurses, and medical equipment. Victoria was admitted to the hospital and put on bed rest to try to delay the birth of her quadruplets. Dr. Chin, the specialist who had been managing her high-risk pregnancy, explained the situation. "The babies are healthy, but they're trying to come early," Dr. Chin said. "We're going to do everything we can to keep them inside for a few more weeks. Every day matters for their development." Victoria lay in the hospital bed, scared and alone. This wasn't how she had imagined her children's birth. She had pictured a calm delivery, maybe with Richard holding her hand, welcoming their babies into the world together. Instead, she was facing the possibility of premature quadruplets with no partner to support her. Mrs. Patterson arrived at the hospital with a bag of Victoria's things and a determined expression. "I'm not leaving you to go through this alone," she announced. "My daughter can manage the bakery for a few days." "You don't have to stay," Victoria said, though she was grateful for the company. "Nonsense. You're family now, and family doesn't abandon each other when things get difficult." Over the next week, Victoria managed to delay the birth. The hospital bed rest was boring and uncomfortable, but it gave her time to think about her future. She had made it this far on her own, building a new life and a successful business. Soon she would be responsible for 4 tiny lives that would depend on her completely. Sometimes, late at night, Victoria wondered what Richard was doing. Was he happy with Stella? Did he ever think about their marriage, about the life they had planned together? Did he wonder why she had disappeared so completely from his world? She had seen pictures of him in magazines that Mrs. Patterson sometimes brought to the hospital. Richard and Stella at charity events, at business dinners, at exclusive parties. They looked like the perfect couple, successful, beautiful, and completely absorbed in their glamorous lifestyle. Do you ever regret not telling him? Mrs. Patterson asked one evening as they watched the sunset through the hospital window. Victoria was quiet for a long moment. Sometimes, she admitted. But then I remember how he looked at me when he chose her. Like I was nothing, like our 8 years together meant nothing. I can't risk my children feeling that same rejection. These babies are going to be so loved, Mrs. Patterson said. You've already given them more than many children get from 2 parents. 2 weeks later, at 34 weeks pregnant, Victoria could no longer delay the inevitable. Her water broke at 3 a.m., and the medical team sprang into action. The delivery room was crowded with doctors and nurses. Each baby would need their own medical team standing by. Are you ready, Victoria? Dr. Chin asked as Victoria was wheeled into the operating room. Victoria nodded, though she felt anything but ready. She was about to become the single mother of 4 premature babies. She had no idea how she was going to manage, but she knew she would figure it out. She had to. The C-section was surreal. Victoria was awake but numb from the waist down, listening to the medical team work efficiently around her. She heard the first cry, then the second, then the third and fourth. 4 healthy cries from 4 healthy babies. 4 beautiful girls, Dr. Chin announced. They're small but strong. Victoria heard each baby cry, and tears streamed down her face. After years of trying to have children with Richard, after the heartbreak of infertility treatments and failed attempts, she was finally a mother. Not just to 1 baby but to 4. The babies were whisked away to the neonatal intensive care unit before Victoria could hold them. At 4 pounds each, they needed special care and monitoring. But Dr. Chin assured her that they were healthy and strong for babies born at 34 weeks. When can I see them? Victoria asked groggily as she was wheeled to recovery. In a few hours, once you're stable, Dr. Chin replied. They're doing beautifully, Victoria. You should be very proud. Mrs. Patterson was waiting in Victoria's recovery room with tears in her eyes and a huge smile. 4 granddaughters, she said, having appointed herself honorary grandmother. I can't wait to meet them. That evening, Victoria was finally able to visit the NICU. Nothing could have prepared her for the sight of her 4 tiny daughters in their incubators, connected to monitors and feeding tubes, but breathing on their own and clearly fighting to grow stronger every day. Have you thought about names? The nurse asked as Victoria stared in wonder at her babies. Victoria had a list of names ready. Emma, Lily, Rose, and Grace, she said softly. I want them to have strong, beautiful names. Over the next month, Victoria practically lived in the NICU. She learned to change diapers through incubator portholes, to feed premature babies, and to read the monitors that tracked her daughter's progress. Mrs. Patterson kept the bakery running, sending daily updates and refusing to let Victoria worry about the business. The whole town is excited about the babies, Mrs. Patterson reported during one of her hospital visits. People keep asking when they can meet them. And that food magazine wants to reschedule their interview for after you're back on your feet. Victoria watched her daughters grow stronger every day. Emma was the biggest and most active. Lily was quiet and observant. Rose had the loudest cry and demanded attention. Grace was the smallest but also the most determined, always fighting to keep up with her sisters. They're going to be handful, one of the NICU nurses said with a laugh. 4 strong-willed little girls. Victoria couldn't wait. After years of feeling ordinary and forgotten, she was about to become the mother of 4 extraordinary daughters. She was going to give them everything she had, love, security, and the knowledge that they were the most important things in her world. When the babies were finally ready to come home, the entire town of Millbrook seemed to rally around Victoria. People brought meals, baby clothes, and offers to help. Mrs. Patterson had converted her spare bedroom into a nursery, insisting that Victoria and the babies stay with her until they could manage on their own. This is what community means, Mrs. Patterson said as they prepared to leave the hospital. We take care of each other. Victoria looked at her 4 daughters, each one perfect and beautiful and completely hers. She had lost a husband, but she had gained so much more. She had found her strength, built a successful business, and now she was the mother she had always dreamed of being. Richard had called her ordinary, but Victoria knew better now. There was nothing ordinary about rebuilding your life from scratch, about starting a business that brought joy to an entire community, or about raising 4 children with love and determination. Victoria Williams was finally exactly who she was meant to be. Coming home from the hospital with quadruplets was like bringing home 4 tiny miracles wrapped in pink blankets. Victoria sat in the back of Mrs. Patterson's car, holding Emma and Lily while Rose and Grace were secured in their car seats, and felt overwhelmed by the responsibility of it all. These 4 little girls were completely dependent on her for everything. Mrs. Patterson had transformed her cozy house into a baby headquarters. The living room now contained 4 cribs, a changing station, and enough baby supplies to stock a small store. The kitchen counter was covered with bottles, formula, and a detailed feeding schedule that Victoria had learned to follow in the NICU. "Don't worry about anything except taking care of those babies," Mrs. Patterson said as she helped Victoria get settled. "I've got the bakery handled and my daughter Sarah is helping too. The whole town wants to pitch in." The first weeks were the hardest of Victoria's life. For babies meant feeding every 2 hours around the clock, which translated to one baby always needing something. Victoria felt like she was living in a fog of exhaustion, moving from one feeding to the next diaper change to the next crying spell without ever really sleeping. But there were moments of pure joy that made everything worthwhile. When Emma first smiled at 6 weeks old, Victoria cried with happiness. When Lily reached for Victoria's finger and held on tight, Victoria felt her heart overflow with love. When Rose and Grace fell asleep together in the same crib, curled up like they were still in the womb, Victoria knew that being their mother was the most important thing she would ever do. "You're a natural at this," Mrs. Patterson said one morning as Victoria efficiently fed 2 babies while rocking a third with her foot. "I've raised 5 children, and I've never seen anyone handle quadruplets with such grace." Victoria laughed tiredly. "I don't feel graceful. I feel like I'm barely keeping my head above water." "That's normal. But look at those babies, they're thriving because of you." It was true. Emma, Lily, Rose, and Grace were growing stronger every day. They had reached healthy weights, passed all their developmental milestones, and were starting to show their individual personalities. Emma was curious about everything around her. Lily was a cuddler who loved to be held. Rose was dramatic and made sure everyone knew when she was unhappy. Grace was observant, always watching her sisters with serious eyes. When the babies were 3 months old, Victoria finally felt ready to return to work at the bakery. Mrs. Patterson had kept the business running beautifully, but Victoria missed the creative outlet and the sense of accomplishment that came from building something with her own hands. "Are you sure you're ready for this?" Mrs. Patterson asked as Victoria prepared 4 baby carriers for their first trip to the bakery. "I have to be," Victoria said. "The girls and I are a team now. We'll figure it out together." The bakery had never been busier. Word had spread about Victoria's quadruplets, and people came from neighboring towns not just for the pastries but to see the famous 4 babies. Victoria set up a play area behind the counter where the girls could nap and play while she worked. "This is better than television," said Mrs. Johnson, one of Victoria's regular customers. "Watching you manage 4 babies and run a bakery at the same time is like watching a superhero in action." Victoria didn't feel like a superhero, but she was starting to feel proud of what she had accomplished. In less than a year, she had escaped a failed marriage, moved to a new town, built a successful business, and become the mother of 4 healthy children. She had done it all without Richard, without his money or his connections or his approval. The Food magazine article came out when the babies were 6 months old. The writer had spent a day with Victoria, documenting her routine of morning baking, customer service, and baby care. The article was titled "Rising from the Ashes: How One Woman Built a Bakery Empire While Raising Quadruplets." "Listen to this," Mrs. Patterson said, reading from the magazine. "Victoria Williams represents the best of American entrepreneurship, taking a personal tragedy and transforming it into triumph. Her bakery serves the best pastries this writer has ever tasted, and her quadruplets are proof that love and determination can overcome any obstacle." Victoria blushed at the praise, but she was also proud. The article brought even more attention to the bakery, with orders pouring in from across the state. People wanted to ship Victoria's cookies and cakes to family members, restaurants wanted to carry her breads, and other magazines wanted to feature her story. "I think you need to expand," Mrs. Patterson said as they looked at the growing list of orders. "Maybe hire more help or even open a second location." Victoria considered the idea as she watched her daughters playing in their carriers. Emma was trying to grab Rose's toy, Lily was babbling happily to herself, and Grace was studying the ceiling fan with intense concentration. These girls were her priority, but they were also her motivation to succeed. "What if we started shipping nationwide?" Victoria suggested. "We could build a website, hire a few more bakers and turn this into something really big." Over the next year, Victoria's Fresh Start Bakery grew into Victoria's Fresh Start Company. She hired 3 full-time bakers, set up an online ordering system, and began shipping her signature items across the country. The Quadruplets, now walking and getting into everything, had their own little corner of the expanded bakery where customers loved to visit them. "Mama work," Grace said one day, her first clear sentence as she watched Victoria decorating a wedding cake. "That's right, baby," Victoria said, picking up her daughter. "Mama work so we can have a good life." Victoria's success was featured in business magazines and local newspapers. She was invited to speak at entrepreneurship conferences and women's business groups. The shy, uncertain woman who had been called ordinary by her ex-husband had become a role model for single mothers and small business owners. But the most rewarding moments were still the quiet ones at home. Bath time with 4 giggling toddlers, bedtime stories read to sleepy girls, and morning snuggles before starting another busy day. Victoria had created exactly the life she wanted, one filled with purpose, love, and the knowledge that she was exactly where she belonged. Sometimes, late at night when the girls were asleep, Victoria wondered what Richard would think if he could see her now. The woman he had discarded as ordinary had built something extraordinary. She had created a life that was entirely her own, filled with success and love, and 4 beautiful daughters who thought she was the most important person in the world. Victoria no longer needed Richard's approval or recognition. She had found something better: self-respect, financial independence, and the deep satisfaction of knowing she could handle anything life threw at her. She was no longer the abandoned wife waiting for someone else to define her worth. She was Victoria Williams, successful businesswoman and devoted mother, and she was proud of who she had become. 5 years had passed since Victoria's divorce, and her life was unrecognizable from the broken woman who had once sat crying on her kitchen floor. Victoria's Fresh Start Company now operated 12 bakeries across 3 states, employed over 60 people, and generated annual revenues of $15 million. Victoria had been featured on the cover of Entrepreneur magazine and named one of the top 40 under 40 business leaders in the country. But Victoria's greatest pride wasn't her business success. It was watching Emma, Lily, Rose, and Grace grow into confident, happy 5-year-olds who filled every day with laughter and adventure. "Mommy, can we help with the new store today?" Emma asked over breakfast, always eager to be involved in Victoria's business activities. "I want to arrange the cookies," Rose added, bouncing in her chair. "Can I count the money?" Lily asked, having inherited Victoria's head for numbers. Grace, always the quietest of the 4, simply smiled and hugged Victoria's leg. "I just want to be with you, Mommy." Victoria's heart melted, as it did every morning when her daughters reminded her of what really mattered. The bakery empire was impressive, but being their mother was her greatest achievement. Victoria was preparing to open her 13th location, a flagship store in the heart of her old city, the same city where Richard still lived and worked. It was a bold move, bringing her business back to the place where her marriage had fallen apart, but Victoria felt ready to face her past. Mrs. Patterson, now Victoria's business partner and the girls' beloved grandmother figure, worried about the decision. "Are you sure about this location, dear? There are other cities where we could expand." "I'm sure," Victoria said, reviewing the architectural plans for the new store. "I left that city feeling like a failure. I want to return as a success." Victoria had kept track of Richard's life through business magazines and social media, though she tried not to make it a habit. Richard's construction company was doing well, but not spectacularly. He and Stella had gotten engaged 2 years ago, but Victoria noticed they had postponed their wedding twice. Recent photos showed them at fewer social events, and Richard looked tired in a way Victoria remembered from the end of their marriage. Victoria felt no satisfaction in Richard's apparent struggles. She had moved beyond anger and hurt to a place of indifference. Richard was part of her past, but he had no place in her future or in her daughters' lives. The grand opening of Victoria's Fresh Start flagship was scheduled for a Saturday in September. Victoria had planned a celebration with live music, free samples, and activities for children. The local media was covering the event, and Victoria had invited several business leaders and city officials. She was putting the finishing touches on a display of her signature items when Mrs. Patterson approached with a concerned expression. "Victoria, I think you should see this," Mrs. Patterson said, holding out a newspaper. The society page featured a large photograph of Richard and Stella at a charity gala the previous weekend. But it wasn't a happy picture. Richard looked uncomfortable in his tuxedo, and Stella appeared to be in the middle of an animated argument with him. The caption read, "Construction mogul Richard Williams and fiancée Stella Morrison share tense moment at Children's Hospital fundraiser." Victoria studied the photo with detached curiosity. Richard's face showed the same strained expression she remembered from their final months together. Stella, still beautiful but somehow sharper looking than in earlier photos, had her finger pointed at Richard's chest in an accusatory gesture. "Trouble in paradise," Mrs. Patterson observed. "That's not our concern," Victoria said, folding the newspaper and setting it aside. "We have our own lives to focus on." But Victoria's past was about to collide with her present in a way she never expected. That afternoon, as she was training the new store manager, her assistant approached with a strange expression. "Victoria, there's someone here to see you," she said quietly. "He says he's your ex-husband." Victoria felt her stomach drop. Richard was here in her store 5 years after their divorce. She hadn't seen him or spoken to him since the day he moved out of their house. "Tell him I'm busy," Victoria said, her voice steadier than she felt. "He's not alone," her assistant continued. "There's a blonde woman with him, and they both look upset about something." Victoria took a deep breath. She had built an empire, raised 4 children, and overcome every challenge life had thrown at her. She could handle seeing Richard again. Victoria walked to the front of the store and saw them immediately. Richard looked older, with gray at his temples and lines around his eyes that hadn't been there during their marriage. Stella was still stunning, but there was a hardness to her beauty that made her seem less approachable than in her magazine photos. "Hello, Richard," Victoria said calmly. Richard stared at her in shock. Victoria knew she looked different too, more confident, more polished, more successful. She was wearing a tailored business suit and the kind of jewelry that came from earning your own money. Her natural hair was styled in a sophisticated cut, and she carried herself with the assurance of a woman who had built something significant. "Victoria," Richard said, his voice uncertain. I had no idea this was your business. I saw the name in the newspaper and thought it might be a coincidence." "No coincidence," Victoria replied. "I started this company after our divorce." Stella stepped forward, looking Victoria up and down with obvious assessment. "You're Richard's ex-wife? The interior decorator?" "I'm a businesswoman," Victoria corrected. "I own Victoria's Fresh Start Company. We operate 12 bakeries and employ over 60 people." Victoria saw Richard's eyes widen as he processed this information. The woman he had called ordinary had built something extraordinary. "That's impressive," Richard said, and Victoria could hear genuine surprise in his voice. "I always knew you were talented." Victoria almost laughed at the irony. Richard had never shown any interest in her talents during their marriage. He had treated her ambitions like hobbies, secondary to his own career goals. "What can I do for you?" Victoria asked, keeping her tone professional. Richard and Stella exchanged a look, and Victoria could see the tension between them. Whatever problems the newspaper had hinted at seemed to be very real. "We were hoping to order some items for our wedding," Stella said, though her voice lacked enthusiasm. "Richard mentioned you used to bake." Victoria gestured toward the display cases filled with elegant cakes, pastries, and desserts. "We do custom orders, but our calendar is booked several months in advance." "Money isn't an issue," Stella said quickly, as if that solved everything. "It's not about money," Victoria replied. "It's about time and commitment to our existing clients." Victoria saw Richard studying her intently, as if trying to reconcile the confident businesswoman in front of him with the wife he had left behind. She wondered what he was thinking, whether he regretted his choices, whether he ever thought about what their life might have been like if he had valued what they had together. But Victoria realized she didn't really care what Richard thought anymore. His opinion had once been the most important thing in her world, but now it was irrelevant. She had built a life that didn't require his approval or validation. "I'll have my assistant check our availability," Victoria said diplomatically. "If we can accommodate your request, someone will contact you." As Richard and Stella left the store, Victoria felt a strange sense of closure. Seeing Richard again had confirmed what she already knew. She had moved on completely. The man who had once been the center of her universe was now just a stranger with whom she had shared a different life. Mrs. Patterson approached as Victoria watched them walk away. "How do you feel?" "Free," Victoria said without hesitation. "Completely free." That evening, as Victoria helped Emma, Lily, Rose, and Grace with their homework, she reflected on how much her life had changed. 5 years ago, she had been desperate for Richard's love and approval. Now she had 4 daughters who thought she was perfect, a business that provided for dozens of families, and the deep satisfaction of knowing she had built something meaningful with her own hands. Victoria had learned the most important lesson of all: she didn't need anyone else to complete her. She was already whole, already enough, already extraordinary in every way that mattered. On a crisp morning in October, Victoria was reviewing quarterly reports when her assistant brought in the day's mail. Among the usual business correspondence and customer letters was an elegant cream-colored envelope addressed in formal calligraphy to Ms. Victoria Williams. Victoria recognized the expensive paper immediately, the kind used for high-end wedding invitations. Her heart skipped a beat as she opened the envelope, though she already suspected what she would find inside. Mr. Richard Williams and Miss Stella Morrison request the pleasure of your company at their wedding celebration on Saturday, November 15th, at the Grand Ballroom of the Metropolitan Hotel. Victoria stared at the invitation, feeling a mixture of emotions she couldn't quite identify. After 5 years together, Richard and Stella were finally getting married. The postponements and delays were over, and they were ready to make their relationship official. Mrs. Patterson walked into Victoria's office and immediately noticed her expression. "What's wrong, dear?" Victoria handed her the invitation without saying a word. Mrs. Patterson read it quickly, then looked at Victoria with concern. "Why would they invite you to their wedding?" Mrs. Patterson asked. "That seems unnecessarily cruel." "I don't think it's meant to be cruel," Victoria said slowly. "I think it's Richard's way of trying to show me that he's moved on, that he's happy with his choice." Victoria studied the invitation more carefully. The wedding was being held at the most expensive hotel in the city, with a guest list that probably included hundreds of business associates and society figures. It was exactly the kind of glamorous event that Richard had always loved, the kind of celebration that would be featured in magazines and talked about for months. "You're not seriously considering going, are you?" Mrs. Patterson asked. Victoria was quiet for a long moment. The smart thing would be to throw the invitation away and forget about it. She had built a wonderful life without Richard, and attending his wedding would serve no purpose except to satisfy curiosity. But another part of Victoria was intrigued by the idea. For 5 years she had been the woman who disappeared after her divorce, the ex-wife who had quietly faded into the background while Richard moved on with his glamorous new life. Nobody in their old social circle knew what had become of her. "What if I did go?" Victoria said, surprising herself by voicing the thought. "Victoria, that's a terrible idea," Mrs. Patterson said immediately. "Why would you put yourself through that?" "Because I'm not the same woman who was discarded 5 years ago," Victoria replied, her voice growing stronger. "I've built something amazing. I have 4 beautiful daughters. I'm successful and confident and happy. Maybe it's time people knew that." Victoria thought about Emma, Lily, Rose, and Grace, now 5 years old and full of personality and intelligence. Richard had no idea he had 4 daughters, no idea that his DNA was walking around in 4 little girls who looked exactly like him. The resemblance was unmistakable. They all had Richard's dark hair, his strong jawline, his determined expression. "What are you thinking?" Mrs. Patterson asked, recognizing the look in Victoria's eyes. "I'm thinking that Richard spent 5 years believing he made the right choice," Victoria said. "Maybe it's time he learned the truth about what his choice really cost him." Over the next few days, Victoria found herself obsessing over the wedding invitation. She researched the venue, looked up the guest list through social media, and even found the wedding registry online. Richard and Stella had registered for expensive art, luxury linens, and kitchen appliances that cost more than many people's monthly salaries. Victoria showed the invitation to her daughters one evening, curious about their reaction. "Who's getting married, Mommy?" Emma asked, studying the fancy paper. "Someone I used to know a long time ago," Victoria said carefully. "Can we go to the wedding?" Rose asked excitedly. "I love weddings. Can we wear pretty dresses?" Victoria looked at her 4 daughters, so innocent and beautiful, and made a decision that would change everything. "Actually," Victoria said, "I think we will go to this wedding." Mrs. Patterson nearly dropped her coffee cup when Victoria told her the plan. "You want to take the girls?" "Victoria, are you sure about this?" "I've never been more sure of anything," Victoria replied. "For 5 years, Richard has lived his life believing he made the right choice when he left me for Stella. He thinks he upgraded, thinks he chose someone better. But he has no idea what he really gave up." Victoria began planning her appearance at Richard's wedding with the same attention to detail she brought to her business ventures. She would attend not as the broken ex-wife seeking revenge, but as the successful woman who had built an extraordinary life from the ashes of her marriage. First, she needed the perfect outfits. Victoria took the girls shopping at the most exclusive children's boutique in the city, selecting identical dresses in soft pink that would photograph beautifully and make the girls look like little angels. For herself, she chose an elegant burgundy dress that was sophisticated without being flashy, expensive without being ostentatious. Why are we getting such fancy dresses, Mommy? Lily asked as Victoria arranged for the dresses to be tailored perfectly. Because sometimes it's important to look our very best, Victoria explained. We're going to a special event where we want to make a good impression. Victoria also arranged for transportation that would make an impact. Instead of driving her practical SUV, she hired a luxury limousine for the day. She wanted to arrive at Richard's wedding in style with her 4 daughters, showing everyone exactly what Richard had unknowingly lost. The more Victoria thought about her plan, the more excited she became. This wasn't about revenge or causing drama. This was about truth. Richard deserved to know he had 4 children, and her daughters deserved to know they had a father, even if he had forfeited the right to be part of their lives. I still think this is a mistake, Mrs. Patterson said as Victoria finalized the arrangements. What if seeing Richard confuses the girls? What if it opens up questions you're not ready to answer? The girls are old enough to understand basic truths, Victoria replied. And they're smart enough to see that their father chose a different life. But they also deserve to see that their mother is strong and successful and not ashamed of the choices she made. Victoria spent the week before the wedding preparing herself mentally for the confrontation. She practiced what she would say to Richard when he saw the girls, how she would explain their presence, how she would handle Stella's reaction. But most importantly, she prepared herself to walk into that ballroom with her head held high, knowing that she had nothing to apologize for and everything to be proud of. The night before the wedding, Victoria tucked Emma, Lily, Rose, and Grace into bed and read them their favorite story. As she looked at their faces, so trusting and innocent, she felt a moment of doubt about her plan. Mommy, are you excited about the wedding tomorrow? Grace asked sleepily. Yes, baby, Victoria said, smoothing Grace's hair. Tomorrow is going to be a very important day for all of us. Victoria knew that attending Richard's wedding would change everything. Once Richard saw the girls, there would be no going back to their separate lives. The truth would be out and Victoria would have to deal with the consequences. But Victoria was no longer the frightened, abandoned wife who had hidden from conflict. She was a successful businesswoman, a devoted mother, and a woman who had learned to stand up for herself and her children. If Richard wanted to be part of their lives, he would have to prove he deserved that privilege. And if he didn't, well, Victoria and her daughters would continue to thrive without him, just as they had for the past 5 years. Either way, tomorrow would be the day that Richard Williams learned the true cost of the choice he had made 5 years ago. The morning of Richard's wedding dawned bright and clear, as if the universe was setting the stage for the most important day of Victoria's post-divorce life. She woke early before Emma, Lily, Rose, and Grace, and spent a few minutes in quiet reflection, gathering her courage for what lay ahead. Victoria had barely slept the night before, alternating between confidence in her decision and moments of pure terror about what she was about to do. But as she watched the sunrise through her bedroom window, she felt a sense of calm settle over her. This was the right thing to do for her and for her daughters. Good morning, beautiful girls, Victoria said as she woke each of her daughters with gentle kisses. Today is our special day. The girls were excited about wearing their fancy dresses and riding in a limousine, though they didn't fully understand the significance of where they were going. Victoria had told them they were attending a wedding where they might meet some people from her past, but she hadn't explained that one of those people was their father. Victoria helped each girl with her hair, creating soft curls that framed their faces perfectly. Emma, always the leader, stood still while Victoria worked. Lily asked a dozen questions about the wedding. Rose danced around the room, unable to contain her excitement. Grace watched everything with her serious, observant eyes. You all look like princesses, Victoria said as she stepped back to admire her daughters in their matching pink dresses. The most beautiful princesses in the world. Victoria's own preparation took longer than usual. She wanted to look perfect, not to impress Richard, but to show him exactly what he had lost. She chose jewelry that she had bought for herself with money from her business, styled her hair in an elegant updo that showed off her natural beauty, and applied makeup that enhanced rather than hid her features. When Victoria looked in the mirror, she saw a woman who bore little resemblance to the broken wife Richard had left behind. This woman was confident, successful, and surrounded by love. This woman had built something extraordinary from nothing. Mrs. Patterson arrived to help with final preparations and to wish them luck. She was still worried about Victoria's plan, but she could see that Victoria's mind was made up. You look stunning, Mrs. Patterson said as Victoria made a final check of her appearance. Those girls are lucky to have you as their mother. And I'm lucky to have them, Victoria replied, watching Emma help Grace with her shoes. They've made me stronger than I ever thought I could be. The limousine arrived exactly on time, a sleek black vehicle that looked expensive and important. The girls were thrilled, bouncing on the leather seats and exclaiming over the minibar and television. "This is the fanciest car I've ever been in," Rose announced, pressing her face to the tinted window. "Wait until you see the hotel," Victoria said, thinking of the Metropolitan's grand ballroom where Richard and Stella were about to make their vows. During the drive into the city, Victoria explained a little more about what they might encounter at the wedding. "We're going to see a lot of people I used to know," she told the girls. "Some of them might be surprised to see us and they might ask questions about who you are." "What should we tell them?" Emma asked, always practical. "Tell them the truth," Victoria said. "Tell them you're my daughters, and that we're here because we were invited." Victoria had spent considerable time deciding when to make their entrance. Too early and they might get lost in the crowd of arriving guests. Too late and they might miss the impact she was hoping to create. She had decided to arrive just as the ceremony was ending, when guests would be moving to the cocktail reception. As the limousine pulled up to the Metropolitan Hotel, Victoria felt her heart begin to race. Through the windows she could see other wedding guests arriving, women in expensive dresses and men in tailored suits, exactly the kind of people who had made up her and Richard's social circle during their marriage. "Are you ready, girls?" Victoria asked, taking a deep breath. "Ready, Mommy," they chorused, and Victoria marveled at their innocence and trust. Victoria had timed their arrival perfectly. As they entered the hotel's elegant lobby, she could hear music from the ceremony ending and guests beginning to move toward the cocktail reception. Victoria took each girl's hand, Emma and Lily on her left, Rose and Grace on her right, and walked toward the ballroom with her head held high. The scene that greeted them was exactly what Victoria had expected. The Metropolitan's ballroom had been transformed into a wedding wonderland, with white flowers, crystal chandeliers, and enough luxury to fill a magazine spread. Guests in expensive attire mingled with champagne glasses, discussing business and social gossip. Victoria immediately spotted several people she recognized from her married life. Former friends who had taken Richard's side in the divorce, business associates who had dropped her when she was no longer connected to Richard's success, couples who had simply forgotten she existed once she was no longer part of their social circle. The first person to notice Victoria was Jennifer Morrison, a woman who had been in Victoria's book club during her marriage. Jennifer's mouth fell open when she saw Victoria, looking elegant and confident with 4 beautiful daughters by her side. "Victoria?" Jennifer said, approaching cautiously. "Is that really you?" "Hello, Jennifer," Victoria said warmly. "It's good to see you." Jennifer's eyes moved from Victoria to the girls, taking in their obvious resemblance to each other and their striking beauty. "Are these your daughters?" "Yes," Victoria said proudly. "Emma, Lily, Rose and Grace. Girls, say hello to Mrs. Morrison." The girls greeted Jennifer politely, their good manners and sweet personalities immediately charming everyone within earshot. Victoria noticed other guests beginning to notice them, conversations pausing as people recognized her and tried to make sense of her presence. "They're beautiful," Jennifer said, still staring at the girls in amazement. "How old are they?" "5, Victoria replied, watching as Jennifer's eyes widened with realization. 5 years old. The same age as Victoria's divorce from Richard. Jennifer, like everyone else who had known them during their marriage, was clearly doing the math in her head. More people began to approach, drawn by curiosity and the obvious drama of Victoria's unexpected appearance. Victoria greeted each person politely, introducing her daughters with pride and answering questions about her life with confidence. "I heard you moved away after the divorce," said Margaret Chin, another former friend. "What are you doing now?" "I own a bakery company," Victoria said simply. "We have 13 locations across 3 states. Victoria could see the surprise and perhaps a little jealousy in Margaret's eyes. These people had expected Victoria to disappear quietly after her divorce, to fade into obscurity while Richard moved on to bigger and better things. They hadn't expected her to build something successful, to return with 4 beautiful children and an obvious confidence that came from genuine achievement. As word of Victoria's presence spread through the reception, Victoria knew it was only a matter of time before Richard and Stella learned she was there. She positioned herself and the girls near the entrance to the ballroom, where they would be impossible to miss. Emma tugged on Victoria's dress. "Mommy, everyone is staring at us." "That's okay, sweetheart," Victoria said, stroking Emma's hair. "Sometimes people stare when they see something beautiful and unexpected." Victoria felt a familiar presence before she saw him. Richard was walking toward them across the ballroom, his face a mixture of shock, confusion, and something that might have been fear. Stella was beside him, looking stunning in her wedding dress but clearly agitated about something. This was the moment Victoria had been preparing for. 5 years after Richard had chosen another woman over their marriage, 5 years after he had called her ordinary and walked out of her life, he was about to learn the truth about what his choice had cost him. Victoria stood straighter, held her daughter's hands tighter, and prepared to change everything. Richard stopped dead in his tracks when he saw Victoria across the ballroom. For a moment, he looked like he might be seeing a ghost, the woman he had divorced 5 years ago, standing in his wedding reception with 4 children who bore an unmistakable resemblance to his own family features. Stella, radiant in her designer wedding gown, followed Richard's gaze and immediately understood that something was very wrong. Her smile faltered as she took in the scene, her new husband staring at his ex-wife, who was surrounded by 4 beautiful little girls in matching pink dresses. "Richard," Stella said sharply, grabbing his arm. "Who is that woman and why is she here?" But Richard couldn't speak. He was staring at Emma, Lily, Rose, and Grace with a look of dawning recognition that made Victoria's heart pound. The girls had inherited Richard's dark hair, his strong jawline, and his intelligent eyes. Anyone who knew Richard well would see the resemblance immediately. Victoria watched as Richard's face went through a series of emotions: shock, confusion, realization, and finally, a kind of desperate hope mixed with terror. She could practically see him doing the math in his head, counting back 5 years to when these children would have been conceived. "Victoria," Richard said, his voice barely above a whisper as he approached them. "What are you doing here?" "You invited me," Victoria replied calmly, pulling the wedding invitation from her purse. "I thought it would be rude not to attend." Stella's eyes narrowed as she looked back and forth between Richard and Victoria. She was clearly sensing the tension but didn't yet understand its source. "Richard, you didn't tell me you invited your ex-wife to our wedding." "I didn't," Richard said, never taking his eyes off the 4 girls. "The invitation was sent by the wedding planner to everyone on our guest list. Victoria must have been left on there by mistake." "It wasn't a mistake," Victoria said smoothly. "It was fate." A crowd was beginning to gather around them. Wedding guests who remembered Victoria from her marriage to Richard were whispering among themselves, clearly fascinated by this unexpected drama. Victoria could hear fragments of their conversations. "Is that really his ex-wife? Those children look just like him. How old do you think they are?" Richard's best man, Thomas, approached the group with a concerned expression. "Richard, is everything all right?" Richard opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He was still staring at the girls with a mixture of wonder and horror, as if he were seeing his own childhood reflected in their faces. Emma, always the boldest of the 4, stepped forward and looked up at Richard with curious eyes. "Are you the man who's getting married today?" "Yes," Richard managed to say. "I am." "You look sad for someone who just got married," Lily observed with the brutal honesty of a 5-year-old. Richard knelt down to the girl's level, and Victoria's heart clenched as she saw him up close for the first time in 5 years. He looked older, more tired, and there was something hollow in his eyes that hadn't been there during their marriage. "What are your names?" Richard asked, his voice shaking slightly. "I'm Emma," Emma said confidently. "This is Lily, that's Rose, and she's Grace. We're quadruplets." "Quadruplets," Richard repeated, the word hitting him like a physical blow. He looked up at Victoria with an expression she had never seen before, complete devastation mixed with desperate hope. "Victoria, are they?" "Yes," Victoria said simply. "They're yours." The words hung in the air like a bomb that had just exploded. Stella gasped and stepped backward, her beautiful wedding dress rustling as she stared at the girls with new understanding. The gathered wedding guests fell silent, absorbing the magnitude of what they had just witnessed. "That's impossible," Stella said, her voice rising. "Richard, tell me that's impossible." Richard stood slowly, his legs seeming unsteady beneath him. "When?" he asked Victoria. "When were they born?" "February 15th, 6 years ago," Victoria replied. "About 8 weeks after our divorce was finalized." Victoria watched as Richard's face crumpled with the realization of what this meant. These children had been conceived during their last attempt at reconciliation, during the brief period when they had tried to save their marriage before he chose Stella instead. "You were pregnant," Richard said, his voice filled with anguish. "You were pregnant when we got divorced and you didn't tell me." "You made your choice," Victoria said calmly. "You chose Stella over our marriage, over our family, over everything we had built together. I wasn't going to let you hurt my children the way you hurt me." Stella's face had gone white beneath her wedding makeup. "Richard, how could you not know you had children?" "Because I didn't know," Richard said, his voice breaking. Victoria, how could you keep this from me? These are my daughters. No, Victoria said firmly. They're my daughters. You gave up any claim to them when you walked out of our marriage for another woman. Rose, who had been watching the adults with growing concern, tugged on Victoria's dress. Mommy, why is everyone upset? Did we do something wrong? Victoria immediately knelt down and gathered all 4 girls close to her. No, babies, you didn't do anything wrong. You're perfect and I love you more than anything in the world. The tenderness in Victoria's voice and the obvious love between her and her daughters seemed to break Richard completely. Tears began streaming down his face as he watched his ex-wife comfort the children he had never known existed. Victoria, please, Richard said, reaching toward the girls. Let me talk to them. Let me explain. Explain what? Victoria asked, standing and putting herself between Richard and her daughters. That you chose a glamorous lifestyle over the family you already had? That you called their mother ordinary and threw away 8 years of marriage for someone you barely knew? The wedding guests were now openly staring, some of them recording the confrontation on their phones. This was the kind of drama that would be talked about for years, the society wedding that became a public revelation of family secrets. Stella, who had been silent during this exchange, suddenly found her voice. I can't do this, she said, her voice high and strained. Richard, I married you thinking you were free, thinking your past was behind you. I didn't sign up to be a stepmother to 4 children. Stella, please, Richard said, turning to his new wife with desperation. We can work this out. Work this out. Stella laughed bitterly. Your ex-wife just showed up at our wedding with your quadruplets. How exactly do we work that out? Victoria watched this exchange with a mixture of satisfaction and sadness. She had wanted Richard to see what he had lost, but seeing him fall apart in front of everyone was harder than she had expected. We should go, Victoria said to her daughters. This isn't our celebration. Wait, Richard said, grabbing Victoria's arm. Please don't take them away again. I just found out I have children. I have rights. Victoria looked down at Richard's hand on her arm, then back up at his face. You have no rights, she said quietly. You gave up your rights when you chose someone else over your family. You've missed 5 years of their lives, Richard. 5 years of first words and first steps and bedtime stories and birthday parties. You don't get to walk back into their lives just because it's convenient for you now. I didn't know, Richard said desperately. If I had known you were pregnant, I never would have left. But you did leave, Victoria replied. You left me for her, and you would have left your children too if it meant keeping your new lifestyle. I protected them from that rejection. Grace, who had been quietly observing everything, stepped forward and looked up at Richard with serious eyes. Are you our daddy? The question hung in the air like a challenge. Richard looked down at his youngest daughter, seeing his own eyes looking back at him, and broke down completely. Yes, he whispered. I'm your daddy, and I'm so sorry I haven't been there for you. Grace considered this for a moment, then shook her head. No, you're not our daddy. Our daddy is in heaven and he watches over us. You're just a man who made mommy sad. The simplicity and wisdom of Grace's words hit everyone like a physical blow. Richard sank into a nearby chair, overwhelmed by the magnitude of what he had lost and the innocence of the child who had just rejected him. Victoria gathered her daughters and began walking toward the exit. She had accomplished what she came to do. Richard now knew the truth about what his choices had cost him. But she also knew that her daughter's well-being came first, and this emotional scene was becoming too much for them to handle. Victoria, Richard called after her. This isn't over. I want to be part of their lives. Victoria stopped and turned back to look at him one last time. Then you'll have to prove you deserve that privilege, she said. And right now you have a wife to take care of. As Victoria and her daughters walked out of the ballroom, she heard Stella's voice rising behind them. I want an annulment, Richard. I didn't marry you to become part of this mess. Victoria didn't look back. She had spent 5 years building a life without Richard, and she wasn't going to let his sudden reappearance destroy the peace and stability she had created for her daughters. But as they rode home in the limousine, Victoria knew that everything had changed. Richard now knew about Emma, Lily, Rose, and Grace, and he would want to be part of their lives. Victoria would have to navigate this new reality while protecting her daughters from any more pain. Mommy, Emma said as they drove through the city. Why was that man so sad? Victoria looked at her 4 beautiful daughters, so innocent and trusting, and made a promise to herself. Whatever happened next, she would make sure that Richard's presence in their lives would be on her terms, in a way that protected and benefited the children who had become her whole world. 2 weeks after the wedding confrontation, Victoria was in her office reviewing expansion plans when her assistant knocked on the door. "There's a man here to see you. He says his name is Richard Williams." Victoria's stomach tightened. She had been expecting this visit ever since the wedding, but she still wasn't sure she was ready for it. "Send him in." Richard looked terrible. His usually perfect hair was disheveled, his expensive suit was wrinkled, and his eyes had the hollow look of someone who hadn't slept in days. He stood in the doorway of Victoria's successful business, taking in the professional space she had created, the awards on her walls, the evidence of everything she had built without him. "Hello, Victoria," he said quietly. "Richard." Victoria gestured to the chair across from her desk. "I assume you're here to discuss the girls." Richard sat down heavily and ran his hands through his hair. "Stella asked for an annulment. She said she couldn't handle being married to someone with so much baggage from his past." Victoria felt a brief moment of satisfaction, followed immediately by concern. "I'm sorry to hear that." "No, you're not," Richard said with a bitter laugh. "And I don't blame you. I destroyed my marriage to you, and now I've destroyed my marriage to her. I seem to be very good at ruining relationships." Victoria studied Richard's face, seeing genuine pain and regret there. This wasn't the confident, arrogant man who had left her for a supermodel. This was someone who had finally realized the true cost of his choices. "Why are you here, Richard?" Victoria asked. "I want to meet my daughters properly," Richard said. "I want to be part of their lives if you'll let me." Victoria leaned back in her chair. "Why should I let you? You've missed 5 years of their lives. You've never changed a diaper, never read them a bedtime story, never comforted them when they were sick. What makes you think you deserve to be their father now?" "Because they're my children too," Richard said, his voice rising slightly. "Because I have rights." "No," Victoria said firmly. "You have no rights. Your name isn't on their birth certificates. You've never paid child support. You've never even acknowledged their existence until 2 weeks ago. Legally and morally, you're just a stranger to them." Richard's face crumpled. "Victoria, please. I know I made terrible mistakes. I know I hurt you in ways I can never take back. But these children are innocent. They shouldn't have to pay for my failures." Victoria was quiet for a long moment, thinking about Emma, Lily, Rose, and Grace. They were happy, well-adjusted children who had never felt the absence of a father because Victoria had worked so hard to give them everything they needed. But she also knew that someday they would have questions about their biological father, and she wanted to be able to give them honest answers. "If I were to consider letting you meet them properly," Victoria said slowly, "it would be on my terms at my pace and only if I believe it's in their best interest." Richard nodded eagerly. "Whatever you think is best. I just want a chance to know them." "First, you need to understand something," Victoria continued. "These girls have a father figure in their lives. His name is James Morrison and he's been dating me for the past year. He loves them and they love him. You would not be replacing him." Richard's face darkened with jealousy. "Who is he?" "He's a pediatrician," Victoria said. "He's kind, patient, and wonderful with children. He treats Emma, Lily, Rose, and Grace like they're his own daughters, and he's never once tried to replace you because, to him, you were never really there to begin with." The mention of another man in Victoria's life clearly stung Richard, but Victoria didn't care. She had moved on, found love again, and built a family that included people who actually showed up for her and her children. "Second," Victoria continued, "if you want to be part of their lives, you need to prove that you're committed for the long term. Not just when it's convenient, not just when you're feeling guilty, but through homework help and soccer games and teenage drama and everything else that comes with being a parent." "I want that," Richard said. "I want all of it." "Third, you need to go to therapy. You need to figure out why you make such destructive choices in your relationships, and you need to become the kind of person who can be trusted with children's hearts." Richard nodded. "I'll do whatever it takes." Victoria looked at this broken man who had once been her husband, who was the biological father of her children, and felt something she hadn't expected: pity. Richard had chosen glamour over love, excitement over stability, and now he was alone with nothing but regrets. "I'll think about it," Victoria said finally. "But Richard, if I do decide to let you into their lives and you hurt them or disappoint them or treat them like they're less important than your career or your social life, I will make sure you never see them again. Do you understand?" "I understand," Richard said quietly. After Richard left, Victoria sat in her office thinking about the conversation. Part of her wanted to protect her daughters from any possibility of disappointment. But another part of her knew that they deserved the chance to know their biological father, even if that relationship would be complicated. That evening Victoria talked to James about Richard's visit. James Morrison was everything Richard wasn't: steady, reliable, and completely devoted to Victoria and her daughters. He had proposed to Victoria 3 months ago, and they were planning a quiet wedding in the spring. "What do you think I should do?" Victoria asked as they watched Emma, Lily, Rose, and Grace playing in the backyard. "I think you should trust your instincts," James said, putting his arm around Victoria. "You've protected those girls and raised them beautifully for 5 years. You'll make the right decision for them now. Are you worried about another man being in their lives?" Victoria asked. James smiled. "Victoria, I fell in love with you knowing you had 4 children from a previous relationship. I chose to love them as my own. If their biological father wants to be part of their lives, and if that's what's best for them, then I support that completely." This was why Victoria loved James. He was secure enough in himself and in their relationship to put the children's needs first, even if it meant sharing their affection with someone else. Over the next few weeks, Victoria watched Richard carefully. She saw him start therapy, saw him turn down social invitations to focus on personal growth, saw him ask thoughtful questions about child development and parenting. Slowly, very slowly, she began to believe that his desire to know his daughters might be genuine. 6 months later, Victoria arranged the first supervised visit between Richard and his daughters. They met at a neutral location, a family restaurant where the girls would feel comfortable and Victoria could observe how Richard interacted with them. "Girls," Victoria said as they sat down at the table, "I want you to meet someone. This is Richard, and he's your biological father." Emma, now 6 years old and even more confident than before, studied Richard with serious eyes. "Are you the man who made Mommy sad?" "Yes," Richard said honestly. "I made some very bad choices and I hurt your mother. I'm sorry for that." Lily tilted her head. "Why did you hurt Mommy?" Richard looked at Victoria, who nodded encouragingly. She had told him that honesty at an age-appropriate level was important. "Because I thought I wanted different things," Richard said carefully. "But I was wrong about what was important." Rose, ever dramatic, crossed her arms. "Mommy says you left us before we were born." "I didn't know you existed," Richard said. "If I had known about you, I would have made different choices." Grace, still the quietest of the 4, spoke up. "We already have a daddy. His name is James and he's going to marry Mommy." Richard's face showed pain, but he nodded. "I know about James and I'm glad you have someone who loves you. I'm not trying to replace him. I just want to be another person who cares about you if you'll let me." The visit lasted 2 hours and Victoria was surprised by how well it went. Richard was patient with the girls' questions, honest about his mistakes, and genuinely interested in learning about their personalities and interests. When it was time to leave, Emma surprised everyone by hugging Richard goodbye. "Can we see you again?" she asked. Richard looked at Victoria, hope written all over his face. Victoria nodded slowly. Over the following months, Richard became a regular but carefully managed part of the girls' lives. He attended their school plays, helped with homework, and slowly began to build relationships with each of his daughters. It wasn't easy. There were tears, difficult questions, and moments when Victoria questioned her decision. But gradually the girls began to accept Richard as another adult who cared about them. They called him Richard rather than Dad. That title belonged to James, but they seemed to understand that he was special in his own way. A year after their first meeting, Victoria married James in a small ceremony surrounded by family and friends. Emma, Lily, Rose, and Grace served as flower girls, and Richard attended as a guest, watching the woman he had lost marry a man who truly deserved her. After the ceremony, Richard approached Victoria and James. "Thank you," he said simply, "for letting me be part of their lives and for showing me what real love looks like." Victoria looked at Richard, seeing a man who had finally learned the difference between what glittered and what was truly valuable. He would never be the father James was to her daughters, but he was trying to be the best version of himself he could be. "They're lucky to have people who love them," Victoria said. "All of us." As Victoria danced with James at her wedding reception, surrounded by her 4 beautiful daughters and the community that had supported her through everything, she felt completely at peace. She had learned that real love wasn't about grand gestures or perfect appearances. It was about showing up, day after day, choosing the people you love over everything else. Richard had taught her what she didn't want in a partner. James had shown her what true love actually looked like. And Emma, Lily, Rose, and Grace had taught her that she was stronger and more capable than she had ever imagined. Victoria Williams had started as an ordinary woman who thought her worth came from being the perfect wife. She had become an extraordinary woman who knew her value came from within, a successful businesswoman, a devoted mother, and a person who had turned her greatest heartbreak into her greatest triumph. The girl who had once been called ordinary had created a life that was anything but. And she had done it all by learning the most important lesson of all, that she was already enough, exactly as she was.